Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
My name is Amy Draves, and I'm pleased to welcome Bill McGowan to the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Bill is here to discuss his book, Pitch Perfect, How to Say It Right the First Time and Every Time. And I have to say I'm more nervous than usual in giving this introduction, given the title of the book, but whew, we're going to work through it. So he is an Emmy-winning correspondent. He has conducted hundreds of interviews and coached several individuals. Using this experience, he has learned and will share how to craft and deliver the right message in the best way to get a point across effectively. Please join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much. Amy, you did great. You were pitch perfect, if I must say so. I want to thank everybody for foregoing this brilliant sunshine to hear the talk today. I promise you I'll do everything I can to make it absolutely worth your while. I don't know how many of you have noticed, but every year some magazine does a survey of the things in life that scare us to death. And every year the results are pretty consistent. Our sense of our own mortality often is at the top of the list, and getting on an airplane winds up being number 3. And I probably don't have to tell you what year in and year out occupies the number 2 slot. And it's that churn in our stomach we feel an hour before we've got to get up and present. It's the sleepless night the night before. It's the asking yourself, why did I agree to do this? I'm always a wreck before I have to do it. Today, I'd like to give you some tips and techniques on how to get over that, because I find if you're able to move out of this left side of the spectrum where a lot of people find themselves, and you can get to a stage of being okay with it, then you can move on and actually get to the point where you feel a little bit of buzz and enjoyment from standing up and being able to communicate and being persuasive to an audience. This is one of these things that feeds on itself. The more you enjoy it, the more you'll volunteer to do it. The more you do it, the better you'll get at it. It's one of those things that you just need reps over and over again to develop certain skills to really perfect how you're coming across. The one thing that I really want to have you steer clear of more than anything, and this is a theme throughout the book, is this notion of winging it. This sense that, well, I know this subject backwards and forwards, nobody can stump me with a question, I know everything there is under the sun. That's actually a liability in many respects. You should never go into something hoping that magic fairy dust sprinkles down on you in the moment and you're going to be articulate and eloquent and knowledgeable. You have to go in with a game plan. And it doesn't matter whether you're moderating a panel, an industry panel, whether you are a participant on a panel, whether you're just going to a meeting to address people on your team. If you can communicate concisely and get to the point and illustrate your point effectively, chances are that 45-minute scheduled meeting can get done in 30, 35 minutes. And there's no greater gift that you can give somebody these days than time back in their day. Wouldn't it be great if you can get out of that meeting 10 minutes early just because everybody was efficient in communicating? Some of the things I want to talk about today definitely fall under that category. The better you get at this, the more likely you are to shortchange the prep. It's just inevitable. And I want to warn you not to do that. I've had clients come to us for one-on-one training. They're effective executives. They've done it a million times. And we're doing a little role play, and I'll tell them, I think you got to bump up your enthusiasm level. And ultimately, they'll say, don't worry. When it comes time to doing it for real, I'll turn it on. It'll all be fine. And I've never really had a good argument against that until the first presidential debate in the last election. And the president obliged me with giving the ultimate evidence that you cannot shortchange the prep. His camp set up a practice campus in Las Vegas, and next thing you know, he's running off to Hoover Dam to do a photo op and shake hands. He's not watching the videotapes of Mitt Romney's primary debates. He's not putting in any of the legwork. And David Axelrod, his senior advisor, pulled him aside and said, Mr. President, we're a little concerned. You don't seem engaged. You don't seem like you're putting your back into this. And his line to Axelrod was, don't worry, I got this. And so my message to you is, if that guy can't turn it on instantly and flip the switch and be great, there's no hope for the rest of us. So preparation is one of the keys to overcoming nerves. How many of you, I've spoken to a bunch of you before we got started, how many of you feel like nerves are actually impediment to doing well in this situation? Okay, pretty typical. The more you know your content, the less anxiety you're going to feel. It's a solid ratio. You'll probably be most nervous in the first 2 minutes of whatever you have to do, whether it's get up in a meeting, get up in front of a room. If you know those first 2 minutes cold, backwards and forwards, you'll get out of the gate cleanly, you'll build your confidence through the rest of the presentation. If you stumble out of the gate, it's really hard to recover. So after 2 or 3 minutes, I think we all feel that sense of getting into a groove and a rhythm, and your nerves settle down and everything winds up being easier after that. But what also happens is when we get nervous, we start taking short, shallow breaths, almost like mini hyperventilating. And that's what happens when our pulse runs away with us. And what it's doing is it's depleting your lungs of air. You need to be able to get up and speak. So if you find that's the case and you suffer from that little tremble, that little quiver in your voice when you're nervous, and it happens to a lot of people, that's a lack of wind. What I want you to do is 5 minutes before you have to get up to speak, good deep yoga breaths, long inhale through your nose, hold it, long, slow, steady exhale through your mouth. It's going to slow your pulse, it's going to replenish your lungs with air, and it's going to bring stability back to your voice. You don't want that shaky voice being a dead giveaway that you're nervous. Even if you're not nervous, though, we get a shot of adrenaline from the fact that we are now in the spotlight and everybody's watching us. And that does a few things to us. It makes us speak faster than we normally would. So in those first 2-3 minutes, come out with a nice controlled pace. People who speak fast ultimately don't seem confident. You also will probably not land on anybody in the audience the more nervous you are. So right now, it's just natural for me to make good, sustained eye contact with different people in the audience. But when you're nervous, you're probably going to do what I'm doing right now, and that's just sort of scanning the room, not really landing on anybody, just sort of drifting over the tops of people's heads. That may be helpful to you because you're looking into abstraction and it's giving you the privacy to think, but it's not a good technique to connect with your audience. See if you can look in someone's direction, land on them at least for part of a thought, and then move off to somebody else. It's a lot about finding friendly faces in the audience. You want to see those people who smile, who give you that nod of encouragement and remind you, yes, I am not bombing up here. It's going okay. This is not a complete and utter meltdown. And I bet you can find one person in each quadrant of the room who gives you that. So if you have trouble speaking to large groups, just have a conversation with 4 people. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay? No one's going to know you're playing to the same 4 people. You don't want to catch the person who reaches in their pocket and starts like checking their email. That's a confidence killer. The other thing that adrenaline does, it makes it very hard for us to stand still. In fact, I call this the stationary march. I'm actually not moving anywhere, but I'm also not standing still. I'm rocking, I'm swaying, I'm moving around, but it's not a movement with purpose. I'm going to show you a clip right now of what I mean by that.
2 quick good stories and 1 bad story. Lots of people have been telling me about Breaking Bad. The Netflix algorithms have been recommending Breaking Bad to me. But, you know, there's a lot of recommendations that algorithms do, and I've just never gotten around to watching Breaking Bad.
I think in those 30 seconds, Reed Hastings' feet actually never stopped moving, right? So, but the fact of the matter is we have this built up physical energy in our bodies from the adrenaline, and we like to get rid of it. And typically it likes to get out through our feet. So to avoid that rocking and swaying and sort of lion in the zoo cage back and forth pacing, what I'd like you to do is stand with your weight a little bit forward on the balls of your feet. You'll feel a little bit of pressure in your toes. That's going to keep you from being back on your heels where this kind of weight shift, sway, and fidgetiness comes from. All the nagging we got as children was probably some of the best communication coaching on the planet. I would strongly advise that you don't stay up till 3 o'clock in the morning working on a PowerPoint that you have to present at 9 a.m. It'd be better to go to bed at 9, get up at 4, finish the thing. You don't want to be groggy, and you don't want to have an empty stomach. It's been medically proven that the synapses in your brain do not fire efficiently if you don't have food in your stomach. Do not skip breakfast. We just talked a little bit about standing up straight, getting your core into it. Eye contact. If you find it's difficult for you to concentrate looking at somebody else looking at you, you know, you could look at the stem of my glasses, or you could look at a woman's earring if you're addressing them in a meeting. It's better than looking at the ceiling, looking down at the floor, looking somewhere else. You're going to have a lot more conviction behind the point you're trying to make if you're making good, sustained, meaningful eye contact. And I was talking to somebody before we got started on this whole notion of you got to fake it till you make it. And you may be in that dread part of the spectrum, but it's really important to relax your audience, to make it seem like you're having a good time being up there and speaking. The only time an audience gets uptight for you is if you seem tense. So in the beginning, until you can actually get to a point of tolerating it and liking it, see if you can just bring a brightness to your expression. Look like there's no place I'd rather be, even if you can't wait to get off the stage. Okay, and a few things your mother did not tell you. No yogurt, no milk the morning of a presentation. It actually creates a frog in your throat, and you will have to clear your throat maybe repeatedly, which you don't want to be doing. Get inside a room like this, walk around, get a sense of how deep it is, how much you're going to have to project to reach the back row. You don't want to stand at a podium or a stage for the first time when you're doing it for real. You don't want anything feeling strange or unusual. Make sure that if you bring your laptop, that a PowerPoint works on that. I have a pair of cufflinks that my assistant gave me. They're the greatest thing in the world. They're actually a USB drive. It's a big square cufflink, and it comes apart. And I always put my presentation on my cufflink in case it gets like corrupted somehow, you know, at the location. And I've actually had to pull that thing out a couple of times. And I learned this one the hard way. I was presenting at a client one time. It was the second time I was there. So, of course, the first time I went, I got on their wireless network, and without me knowing it, it just connected me the second time. And I'm merrily clicking through my slides. I think I'm on the third or fourth slide. And suddenly all my email notifications from the night before start bonging up in the corner of the screen. And it took every ounce of self-control not to lunge at the computer and pull the cord out. Make sure everything is turned off. So before everyone filed in, I don't do this as a strategic way. I like meeting people, but there's a benefit to saying hello to people before you have to get up and speak. And one of them is they may tell you something in this little conversation before you get up to speak that's helpful to you. Maybe they've told you what they ultimately want to come to hear, and you can just do a little bit of tweak or incorporate a story somebody tells you into your presentation to give it a feeling of spontaneity and to pull the room up with you. Be a good listener in these little conversations you have before you get started. It also helps you understand, is this a tough crowd? Is it an easy crowd? How hard am I going to have to work? How convincing am I going to have to be? And also, again, like if you and I have had a talk before we get started, I guarantee you, you probably won't pull your phone out on me. You know, you're going to feel more invested in being that attentive listener. So it's a great way to create that energy in the audience. And warm up. Athletes do it, musicians do it. In your kitchen that morning, making coffee, say the first 2 to 3 minutes of your presentation out loud. Hear how it sounds rolling off your tongue. It's a totally different dynamic than silently imagining what you're going to say in your head. That doesn't accomplish the same goal. So how do you begin? Well, I probably coach about 10 people a week on presentations. And I will tell you that 8 or 9 of them all start out exactly the same. And that's not what we're really going for. One thing people do is they presume that the audience isn't going to be interested in what they're going to say. So I could have gotten up here and I could have said, so listen, I know you all probably want to be outside today because it's a beautiful day, but I'm just going to very quickly walk you through a few things. That absolutely not. Never, ever project in the mind of your audience that somehow you're not going to be scintillating. Okay? I've heard apology for every single speaking time slot in the day. 9 o'clock, you're apologizing because everybody's tired and they just got up. At 11 o'clock, you're apologizing that everybody's hungry and can't wait to get to lunch. At 2 o'clock, you're apologizing because everybody's groggy from lunch. And at 5:30, you're the only thing standing between them and the cocktail hour. I have heard an apology for every single speaking slot in an agenda. So no apology. And I know that the prevalent idea of tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them is well embraced and has been for years. I think it's a dated, dusty approach that everybody does. And because everybody's doing it, you shouldn't be doing it. You should be doing something much more original and figuring out how the first thing coming out of my mouth is going to hook you. Not the agenda setting start, which is, hi, I'm Bill McGowan. I'm the CEO of Clarity Media Group. I want to take a little time today to talk about public speaking, and then I want to give you some examples of some people I think do it well and some people who don't do it well. But before we do that, let me just hit rewind for a minute and take a few steps back and quickly walk you through. Does that sound familiar? Just about everybody does the table of contents open. Absolutely not. I'll show you an example of what I think is the perfect beginning. The agenda setting start has a very fitting acronym, by the way.
I'm a little nervous because my wife, Yvonne, said to me, she said, Jeff, you watch the TED Talks? I said, yes, honey, I love TED Talks. She said, you know they're like really smart, talented people. I said, I know. She said, they don't want like the angry black man. So I said, no, I'm gonna be good, honey, I'm gonna be good, I am, but I am angry. And the last time I looked, this is why I'm excited, but I'm angry. This year, there are going to be millions of our children that we're going to needlessly lose.
So the reason I think this is the perfect open is because he's not telling a joke. Don't start with a joke, ever. If the joke bombs, you will be thrown and rattled and you'll never recover. And you're expecting that laugh and you don't get it, it really is debilitating. What he does is he starts with a story that has funny elements to it, right? But it's not a story that's just a funny story for funny storytelling's sake. The punchline of the story, the fact that he's angry, is the core theme of what he's there to talk about. There's connective tissue between the story and the point of his talk. And that ultimately is what makes it work. And also, you feel like you have a little access to him. You're overhearing, you're a fly on the wall of this conversation he's had with his wife. It's, in my mind, like the perfect start. And I realize it's a TED Talk. You're not going to go in a conference room and necessarily do that. but think, how from my first declarative, concise statement in this meeting can I get people's attention and make them kind of want to know how I'm going to go on to explain this. Try to not start like everybody else does. That comfort zone that you think you're in is a conformity zone, and it's really not a great way to grab people's attention. And then how we articulate ourselves really matters. Just about every brilliant person throughout history has subscribed to this notion of simplicity. Don't use a 25-cent word when a 5-cent word is perfectly functional and suffices. But this is something I hear in just about every company I go to work for. These words like planful and choiceful, and I don't know where these words come from. They're not in the dictionary. They, if they're on your computer and you've written them and there's a red line underneath it, that means it's not a word. That means this word should not be crossing your lips. And I hear them all the time. And ironically, a woman who I've known a long time who's read the book, and I asked her to come to this function in New York. We were talking about Gwyneth Paltrow and the misstep she had last week. And she said, yeah, she didn't sound very planful in what she was doing there. I'm thinking, have you read the book? Have you? And just be careful of jargon when you are speaking outside the company. I realize that jargon is a verbal shortcut for us when we're speaking with each other in a meeting, but it's very important to realize that when you're speaking to an external audience, it's really good to stay away from these verbal shortcuts. And everybody falls victim to them, or just malaprops in general.
Sometimes you misunderestimated me.
They could refutate what it is that this group is saying.
Yep. This is the jargon one I love.
What are you guys doing?
We're ideating.
ID what?
Ideating.
What's that?
Coming up with new ideas.
Why don't you just call it that?
This is different. We need to rethink the way we do things. Structure.
Process. We need to innovate.
How?
We haven't ideated that yet.
Good luck.
Thanks.
That was an IBM spot from about literally 12 years ago. And the reason it's so funny is because it's so close to the truth. It's barely an exaggeration. So really watch the jargon if you can. So the reason I did this book was because I found that a lot of the principles that I was working with people on how to be better communicators, more efficient, more effective, more persuasive, didn't apply to just being on panels and giving speeches and giving media interviews. I found that they really pervade all high-stakes communication situations in our lives, whether we are coaching our nephew for the big job interview, or whether we are faced with having that difficult conversation with an aging parent that they shouldn't be driving anymore. There are all these things that happen day to day where the way we frame something and the words we use to put our point forward really matter. They often determine the difference between success and failure. And so there are these various principles in the book. One of them that I think is really important speaks to the notion of brevity. And I call it the pasta sauce principle, because if any of you are avid cooks, you know that if you put a pot of sauce on the stove and you cook it down for an hour, 2 hours on a Sunday, that reduction is going to have a lot more flavor and just a dynamic quality to it than if you keep pouring more water into that thing. The verbal equivalent is figuring out a way to say it concisely and directly. Being verbose and buying into this notion that more is like putting water in the sauce. See if you can avoid circular logic, redundancy. It's not helping. You want to make it as lean and mean as you possibly can. And I find that the majority of people, if you think about this as like your thought, you have a beginning, a middle, and an end to this thought that you're trying to convey. I find a lot of people are pretty good getting out of the gate and maybe getting to the crux of what it is they want to say. But then wrapping it up tends to be a real challenge. There's a lot of ad-libbing, there's a lot of excess that's not helping us. And so to avoid that, what I'd like you to think about is, let me do enough preparation and reflection ahead of time to know what my content is. And let me develop the discipline that by the time I open my mouth to start talking to convey this thought, I have a general idea where I'm ending up, what the finish line looks like. Not in a scripted verbatim way. I don't want you to feel like you're rigidly controlled, but I do want you to know, okay, what's the point I'm trying to make here? And how can I back up that point? Do I have a story I can tell? Do I have an example I can give? Do I have a data point that helps illustrate the main point? Those are basically the two components of what makes persuasive discussion and conversation. A point and a way to bring it to life. And if you can't conceptually see what the full arc of your answer contains, when you open your mouth to start, you're talking too long. That's a good barometer. It's not about talking for 35 seconds or 45 seconds. It's about how much control do I have over what I know is going to come out of my mouth over the next 20 seconds. Again, if you can remove as much winging it and saying the first thing that pops into your head, that is never a good strategy. And in fact, you know, the news every week is filled with people who say the first thing that pops into their head, and then they spend a week apologizing for it or restating it or explaining it. It's usually not good. One of the other key principles in the book asks you to think about your brain and your mouth as two cars on the road, okay? And your brain is always the lead car. It's always about a millisecond ahead of your mouth. And it is basically figuring out what conversational road you're going to go down and what words you're going to use to express that thought. And we'd like to think that when your brain gets to that intersection, it makes the decisions very efficiently. And that's not always the case. Sometimes we come up to a juncture and we're just not sure about what it is we're supposed to be saying or how we should be saying it. If you buy into this notion that you need to have a steady stream of sound coming out of your mouth, that's the equivalent of your mouth tailgating your brain. And if your brain isn't making that decision efficiently, your mouth has to do something while it's waiting for instructions. And typically, that's where ums, ahs, you knows, kind of, sort ofs, likes come in. The garbage filler that strips us of our conviction and also our executive presence. So, two things to try to get rid of filler, which I have clients every week say, I just would love to rid myself of this. One is being aware of it. Two is adopting this discipline of the less certain I am about the next thing coming out of my mouth, the slower I should be talking. The more pausing I should be building in. That's going to keep you from having a lot of filler and sound coming out of your mouth instead of crisp content. So I like to, this is usually, people love this part for some reason. I don't know why. Maybe it's the question I get asked the most. Okay, who wants to take a crack at one of the six? Pockets. Pardon?
Pockets.
Pockets. Very good. That's one. Please. Very good. That actually is going to be the seventh one. If your hands rise above shoulder level, nothing good is happening. You know, you're either tugging at your ear, scratching your nose, playing with your hair, all fidgety personal grooming stuff that is out. No, 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 no. Okay, so good. Thank you for giving me number 7. So we have pockets. Folded across the chest, never here. Okay, this reeks of, I don't really deserve your attention, but I'm going to be up here talking anyway. It's too apologetic and too passive, okay? So we have folded across the chest, behind the back, in the pockets. Who else? Yes? Figly, very good. This is also not a position, and also praying. This is too high. Okay, so fold it across the check. On your hips is another one. Anybody else? Any other positions?
Holding the lectern.
Yes, very good. We haven't talked about that, but this is what I call podium push-ups, which you actually will see people doing occasionally. This, I understand, provides a lot of security to hang on to this thing for dear life. Not a good idea. In fact, I don't even like to be. If I had my druthers, actually, I would be sort of walking down the aisle a little bit, but I don't want to be doing the bird thing, right? I don't want to be in the light of the projector, and I also don't want to mess up the cameras. But this is a barrier between you and the audience. It'd be better to get out from in front of it, from behind it. And if you have to stand behind it because the mic is there and you're not wirelessly mic'd, stand physically independent of the podium, okay? All right, so the last few are draped by your sides. So I've never seen anybody look comfortable standing in front of a room like this. So what I'd like you to do is, from this position, I want you to create a right angle between your upper arm and your forearm. And I want your hands to come together right around your belt buckle. If you've got a clicker, it's easy, because you can sort of hold the clicker with both hands right around your belt buckle, and it gives you something to hold on to. But suppose you don't have a clicker. Now this is a little bit more difficult, but it may feel a little strange in the beginning, but it looks right. And the reason I like it is because I want to talk with my hands, but I don't want them to have to travel a long distance to be able to gesticulate. And down here they do. And now I'm done with them, and they got a long way to fall to get into a resting position. Here, it's easy in and easy out. I can talk with them periodically and not have to overthink it. The palms of your hands are basically facing in. The backs of your hands are basically facing out. They are not rigidly clenched to show any tension, and they're not shaped so that anybody in the audience is thinking, what's he doing with his hands over there? You want it to just be like you're holding something very delicate between your fingers, okay? And I would say that the piece of advice that rises above all else is see if you can generate genuine enthusiasm for the value of the information you're sharing with your audience. Do not go into this thinking that your definition of success is to get through it technically clean without any hiccups or stumbles or stutters. That's not what it's about. It's about conveying to everybody in the audience that this is important to know. This could be very helpful in what we're doing. And I think you should know this. And I'm looking forward to being able to communicate it to you. Enthusiasm for the value of the information you're sharing. Most important thing. And until you can actually do that in a genuine, organic way, see if you can just bring a little of that flavor to your delivery until you feel it for real. I'd be happy to take any questions you have. Little tip, if you do open up an event you have to Q&A, come with your own first question. And what I mean by that is typically nobody likes to go first in Q&A. So the most awkward part of a presentation is where, okay, so any questions? Beep, beep, beep. And you're thinking, oh my God, nobody has any questions. That's where you want to step in and say, typically when I give talks like this, what I find people are most curious about is X, Y, and Z. Jumpstart your own Q&A with something that you feel is a typical question, because that is an awkward moment, and you don't want to have that sort of referendum that, you weren't really interesting enough to ask any questions. So, everybody, yes?
So one of the things that I find most discombobulating is especially on a large stage, if I have bright lights shining in my face, I can't see the audience at all.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you have any ideas on what to do in that situation.
I think you have to pick zones. So let's say bright lights, got one right here. Think near right, far left, near left. Break the room into those quadrants. You're not going to find that good listener, but think about speaking to that zone. The other thing that's important is if you're on a stage and there are confidence monitors or a teleprompter, I don't know if you have that, realize that if they're on the floor, where they usually are, the closer you are to the foot of the stage, the more disparity in the eye line between the monitor and the audience. It's going to look more like you're reading the prompter, whereas if you back up mid-stage, this gets mitigated, okay? And how many of you have to be in an event where you're reading a prompter or there's some kind of... So the only other thing you want to avoid there is sometimes they have one on this side of the stage and that side of the stage. Try never to read the one you're walking away from, which I see a lot. People sort of sneaking a peek over their shoulder. That immediately looks like you're reading. Okay. Yeah.
Any special advice on presenting charts, numbers, things like that?
If the slide is really dense, I think what can be effective is saying, okay, so we have 10 years of performance here. Here's what I really want to bring your attention to. Like, don't go through every single thing on the chart. There's probably one thing on each slide you want the person in the audience or in the room focusing on, and you have to actually dictate what it is that they're going to zone in on with their eyes. When you throw up a slide, and there's a lot of information in that, a lot of bars, a lot of numbers, a lot of words, you are relinquishing control. Their eyes can go anywhere they want, and what you're saying is almost insignificant. So you almost have to dictate where their eyes should go on the slide. Okay, so the blue line is what I really want to point out here. And here's what it shows, okay? Yeah?
The previous slide, you were talking about where not to put your hands, and I assume that was reflecting when people are standing.
Yes.
I can't quite visualize how you're going to reach your hips when you're standing.
How are you going to what?
Reach all the way down to your hips.
You mean like this?
Oh, okay.
Just, it means hands on your hips walking. It's a little bit of kind of a cocky, stance. If you're seated, you want to avoid, if you're sitting in a conference room or at a table, try not to have hands below the table, back all the way against the back of the chair. I sort of call this the electric chair pose. Feet flat on the floor. I find what really works to develop an engaged, attentive kind of physical presence is think about sitting on at least the front half of the cushion. So my back now is completely separated from the back of the chair. Cross your legs at the ankle and tuck it underneath the chair, forearms on the conference table or whatever it is. And feel an arch in the small of your back. I am sitting up straight right now from the base of my spine. If I let go of that, this is how I look, which is a very different kind of vibe you're giving off. So I want you to think about sitting forward but sitting up, and there's something about your feet in this position that almost kind of lifts you off your chair a little bit. This is what's going to, it's those nonverbal communicating little items that make it seem like you have more conviction in what you're saying, as opposed to, yeah, I think we should do this. You're not really putting your back into that. Yeah?
Is there any value in authenticity? I mean,
is there any what? I'm sorry.
In authenticity, in be authentic, who you really are. I mean, if you're natural in expressing, moving your hands, and then when you're on the stage, then you don't move your hands and you talk completely different.
Yes.
Aren't you perceived a little bit artificial, and then you lose the connection?
I think you should take what makes you feel comfortable in your own skin and just round off those edges that wind up being techniques that distract from what you're saying. So let's take hands for instance. Let's say you're very expressive, and now my hands tend to move constantly, and they never actually rest, right? That can be a little manic and distracting. So if the person came to me and said, I just love to talk with my hands, I'd say, fine, But realize to have them in constant motion doesn't help. You want to think that I want to move my hands when I really want to punctuate something. But then when I'm on information that's of secondary importance, I don't want to be doing this. I don't want to be seeming like I'm trying to artificially pump everything up. And that's one of the points about presenting. Don't try to dial it up to 11 on everything, because then nothing stands out. Pick your spots to really put emphasis and conviction behind it. You can slow down your speaking pace over your big points. You can use your hands. And in that way, you create this sort of vocal bolding and underlining. Yeah?
What about getting off book, or being mostly off book?
Off?
Not using a piece of paper.
Oh. So I was joking around with Amy before she got up that this woman went to introduce me at an event a few months back, and she had a piece of paper, very much like this, and she was nervous. And not only could you see the paper shaking, but you could hear it. So, and I really felt bad for her. So what I typically like are these big index cards. I think they're 5x8s. And if you're a guy and you happen to be wearing a jacket, they fit inside your inner breast pocket. And sometimes I'll just keep those as a backup in case technically everything fails. And I could just sort of, pull them out of my pocket and use them as a guide. And you want to avoid having a sheet of paper like this, like you're going to be reading it. Think about these cards actually anchor your hands. They give you something to do with your hands. But I'm sort of holding them against my torso right now. And now when I need them, I can just look down at it and then return them to their spot. You don't want to create the impression that I need this thing at the ready because I have no idea where I'm going. Yeah.
What is the right balance between, as a speaker, speaking to a set of slides versus being able to speak? So I've seen speakers who are very engaging and just have one visual on the screen, and they actually have you riveted wherever they're on the stage.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've seen people who go by death by PowerPoint vision, where they keep talking and the slide is so busy and like you just can't even keep your eyes open. So as a speaker, what is sort of the in-between, or what is the preferable way to be more effective in communicating what you're saying, and what is the right balance between visual and audio?
Think of you in the PowerPoint like you're a broadcast team for a sporting event. The PowerPoint is the play-by-play guy. You're the color commentator. So that means don't read your slides. Don't be the verbal equivalent of what's on the slide. You want to give context and color, and so see if you can find an alternate way of saying what's on the slide. Also, if you have a presentation you need to give that's really dense in information, see if you can build that deck out. And if you need to distribute it ahead of time or at the meeting, that's what you give. But then take that one and scale it way back and make it as visually sparse as possible, and that's the one you show. The thing you're trying to avoid is battling with yourself and giving them a gazillion things to look at and try to listen to you at the same time. So, but I realized that a really scaled back PowerPoint is a problem, because then the people in the audience say, well, listen, I need this information. You're leaving all this stuff out. Make that a deck that you provide to them in some way. Yeah, in the back.
How do you make adjustments to your presentation if you have a very international audience where English may not be their first language, while still, without being condescending in any way?
Yeah. Maybe opt for making it more visually driven in terms of the content on the slides. See if you can opt for images, which, by the way, are 6,000 times more memorable than words. So you're doing yourself a huge favor by trying to be as much of a visual storyteller as possible. And, I agree with you. I think that your vocal pace can have a big impact on something like this. If you feel like you are about to say a term or a word that may not be immediately recognizable to the audience, maybe just go a little bit slower over that word. You don't want to be condescending where you're saying it really loud and slow the way some people do. You obviously want to stay away from doing that. But careful of idiomatic expressions, which often people from another culture will not be familiar with, or any kind of terminology that may not be in the grasp of somebody who has an okay understanding of the language. Yeah.
So I came to this talk to, not for presentation skills, but I'm in a team that we have a bunch of other teams that rely on what we do, and we need to communicate those ideas clearly and concisely. And the tendency at Microsoft is to write a long email, and you feel if you've written a long email that describes everything, then you're done. And I also see the same thing happen with verbal communication, where people are essentially writing the email when they're talking to someone. But it's not this communication where you're assessing whether the first thing you said was actually understood, and then moving on to your second point and illustration. And a lot of times we fall into point.
Yeah.
And the person is still trying to process the first one. So I don't know if you have anything to say about that dynamic. And
sometimes communicating is like feeding a little child. You know, you have to, here's a spoonful, okay, chew and swallow, okay, you ready for the next one? You know, you want to get a sense for, is your audience ready to move on? Have they digested what I've just told them? This is where empathy comes into play in communication. It's not just about you touching bases A, B, C, and D and getting out of the conference room as early as possible. It's about, do I get the sense that the people around the table have gotten this? And do I need to illustrate these points through real or hypothetical examples to really drive it home? And it's also, I think, fine to say, is that clear? Is everybody okay to move on? You know, I think there's a little bit of a reluctance to gauge the audience in a meeting even.
The other thing is that you don't have to say everything at once.
That's right.
Like, they can, even though we have this half hour now, it doesn't mean we have to tell you absolutely everything in that half hour.
Right.
We could have another one after you.
Yeah, there's this idea of leaving people wanting more, right? Or, thinking, all right, well, we're closing this meeting. What do I want everybody from this meeting doing in the aftermath of this meeting? So maybe you button the meeting not with, all right, so let's review everything we covered. You know, that's not necessarily what I'm suggesting, but what if you were to give the presentation and say, okay, so if nothing else happens out of this meeting, here's what I'd like everybody to ponder, or here's what I would like everybody to come up with a solution for. You know, this idea of call to action, or not marching orders, but it's almost like inspiring them to do something out of the meeting. You know, yes?
In interactive sessions where you have a mixed group and you're presenting either an idea, concept, a product, how do you sort of keep the naysayers and the non-believers in check and keeping them from derailing either your thought process or getting them on board?
I think there's a certain value in acknowledging and validating what the skepticism in the room is, and just getting it out there by saying, now, I know full well this idea has its limitations in some people in the audience. They see it as this, that, and the other thing. Let me explain to you why we believe there's bigger upside to this, regardless of where you come down on that. You know, I think sometimes the naysayers just want you to verbalize and acknowledge the doubts they have, and to not just come at it from a combative, I'm going to cut you off and I'm right and you're wrong. You know, to be able to acknowledge and validate has importance. Yes, I'm sorry.
With limited amount of time, how do you prioritize planning? How do you recommend you do that with your client?
I give them something that I call a message grid, and that is, you're going into a meeting or you're going to be peppered with questions. Try to figure out what the topics of conversation are going to be. in this meeting. So they're going to ask you, what are the potential pitfalls of this plan? What kind of revenue is going to be driven from it? What are competitors doing? You know, there's certain predictable topics that can come up. And on this grid, in these columns, I want you to think, what's my basic point here? And what's my point of illustration? Do I have a data point? Do I have an example I can give? How do I bolster my main point? And just putting bullet point reminders to yourself. It's like a roadmap. Here's topic D that's going to come up in the meeting. This is my point. This is my illustration. I know it. I'm not scripting it out verbatim, but I am creating a navigational guide as to what I'm going to talk about when these different topics in the meeting come up. Yeah.
What about the elevator pitch? Let's say you bump into the executive in the break room, and then they say, how is project XYZ? And you have about 30 seconds to make a good impression.
See if you can stay away from the empty platitudes, which are, oh, I think it's going great. You know, everybody seems really engaged, and, you know, see if you can stay away from the empty stuff. See if you can give them something concrete and say, you know, I wasn't sure until yesterday, and then we had this meeting yesterday in which, you know, 3/4 of the team had great input into how to finalize the plan, and I'm feeling really confident about it. You see if you can, even that little bit of storytelling to give it authenticity rather than just sort of saying what he or she thinks you want them to hear, you know. Stay away from the generalities. See if you can, and to that end, I would heartily recommend that you all get one of these. You probably, a lot of you have it. There are things that happen day to day, week to week, that represent great anecdotal material. Something somebody says to you in a meeting, or you're out having a conference with a client, and they say something, they tell you how some challenge they're having, you've helped them overcome with some innovation you've provided them. Jot that stuff down. Put it in a book somewhere, because these stories are the lifeblood of your participation on panels, your speeches, your presentations. It's really hard the night before a presentation to suddenly think, okay, I need to come up with some stories. Yeah. Start archiving them. It'll be a great thing to be able to draw on. Yeah, it'll be good too. Yeah.
I have a problem just in real life of speaking way too quickly, and that's just 1,000 times worse when I'm on stage.
Yeah.
So everybody always says slow down. I've been told to slow down my entire life, and I can do it for about 20 seconds, and then it's just back on the interstate. So do you have any recommendations for like ways to just force yourself to slow down over a long period of time?
I breathed, right? I would, have you ever seen yourself on video? Okay. So why not do this? Why not grab your phone and prop it up and videotape yourself practicing, right? Your next speech or whatever it is. And then when you're done, check the clock. So let's say you do the first 2 pages and it's 1:43, right? Now try to do it in more than 2 minutes. Okay, see if you can, see what it takes for you to stretch that thing by 17 seconds. And deliberately force yourself to try to chew up more time. But for you, I think what would be really critical is don't try to uniformly slow yourself down. Take the really key takeaway ideas, your big points, and think, all right, these are going to be the selected moments where I downshift and I slow down and I draw it out a little bit more emphatically. I think that's going to work better for you than feeling like I've got to take everything down a certain speed. Think about what your punchlines are, what your big ideas are, slow down over those. Because it is the variation of your speaking pace that makes your voice interesting to listen to. Somebody who's uniformly brisk and talking a mile a minute all the time, it's very easy to lose the engagement of your audience, as is somebody who's very slow and plodding and never steps on the gas. You want both brisk and slow. Yes?
So we have a lot of virtual meetings, so we don't get to see the audience, we don't get to see where they what their reactions are to how you're speaking.
Mm-hmm.
So, any advice or tips to figure out how to best?
Is this a VC meeting or a phone,
Yeah,
like a conference call?
Conference call, maybe a presentation shown on screen.
Right. You're probably sitting at a conference table, right? So I would definitely adopt that kind of forearms on the table. Okay, let's get right to it. You know, I think see if you can take charge with conviction. And, you know, the thing that makes those calls so difficult is everybody stepping over each other because there's a little delay. If you start talking and you hear somebody starting to chime in 2 seconds later, don't stop. Keep going. The worst thing that can happen on those calls is where everybody starts like being really, no, you go. No, you started. You know, that makes a 20-minute call a 40-minute call. But see if you can, you know, the other thing that works for phone calls is not sitting down, is having some notes, and maybe you have a headset, walk around the room. I find that I'm a lot more animated in how I deliver information, and I have a lot more conviction in my voice if I'm moving. The last place you want to do one of these is sitting behind your desk. Because when this meeting starts to get sluggish and you start to get bored, you'll check your inbox. You will. Or you'll see something on your desk saying, oh, man, I was supposed to do that yesterday. Shoot. You know, 1,000,001 distractions behind your desk. Worst place to do a call. Yeah.
You mentioned the over-practicing of the opening to get into the flow. Would you apply the same to the closing, or would you rather have it in a natural flow and kind of trickle out?
Absolutely. I think you should know what's my crisp close to this. Absolutely. It should get every bit as much planning and attention as you're open. Yes?
A similar question. You talked about preparation for the main content. I believe you can do some preparation for Q&A, but how do you handle, you know, things that you have to think through or, you know, are difficult?
You mean questions that are difficult that you might not be able to handle? I think there's nothing wrong with saying to somebody in an audience, you know, I would love to double check that piece of information before I give you an exact number. So maybe you can follow up with me after the meeting, and we can do it one-on-one. You know, it's not the end of the world to say I don't know, but there are ways to do that where you don't make it seem like you're not knowledgeable. If you're asked something very narrow in focus in Q&A in the audience, and you don't know that specific thing, see if you can broaden the scope of the question so you can speak more generally to the topic they've raised. You know, in a Q&A, nobody's going to fire or follow up, pin you down type of question to it.
One more question?
Yes.
Any particular pointers for giving presentations to your management team or senior executives?
Prayer? No. Yeah. I've known people to become fixated on the most powerful person in the room to the exclusion of maybe other semi-powerful people in the room, right? And as a result, some people can feel a little dissed. So I would be diligent about spreading my attention around to the various people on the other side of the table so that, you know, nobody feels slighted, but maybe on the really big points, the stuff that really, really matters, that's when you zone in on the number one decision maker. Okay? Because, you know, I've seen situations where even somebody's executive assistant is sitting next to the CEO in a meeting, and the people pitching them have completely ignored that person, right? And then what happens? They leave the meeting, and the CEO turns to his or her executive assistant and says, what'd you think of those guys? And the assistant feels completely dissed. She goes, I don't know, I thought they were kind of jerks. You know, you cannot afford to slight anybody on the other side of the table, regardless of what their title is. Okay. So thank you very much for coming today. I hope that was helpful in whatever you wind up having to do.